And what's amazing is, it doesn't really matter what we're trying to hold constant. If we're holding age constant, if we're comparing within racial groups, if we're comparing within educational levels, there is this persistent gender gap. It can shrink, it can increase, but what's amazing is it doesn't ever go away. Like even when you're holding race and age and education constant, they can never get it closer than, still being a couple of cents away. And so that just kind of suggests that there really is something going on here. So what is happening? What is causing this gender gap? So we're going to talk about three primary causes, not necessarily in the order that you see them on the slides. We're going to talk about what role does gender discrimination and sexism play? What role does gender job segregation play? And what role does the motherhood penalty play? So gender job segregation, the idea that men and women are concentrated in different jobs, and those different jobs, because of the androcentric pay scale, mean that men who are working in male jobs have higher pay than women who are working in female-dominated jobs. And some research does suggest that about 90% of the explanation for the wage gap does lie in the prevalence of this type of sex segregation among occupations. And so, it raises the question, why do women then choose lower paying jobs? Are they choosing lower paying jobs? What would be the benefits of that? And we'll talk about that more in a second. But it's worth noting that if we're just looking at this type of androcentric pay scale and this gender job segregation, why does it exist? A lot of it has to do with what I discussed, that kind of association with men and the expectation that men should make money that is sufficient, in terms of it being a family wage that they can raise a family on. And traditionally, women, even when they were working for a wage, their incomes were seen as being supplementary to their husbands, or they were seen as being temporary in the sense, you're working this job, but you're not really going to have a household on this job. Eventually you will get married and your husband's going to be the primary breadwinner. And so that type of that pervasive type of notion kind of trickled into how we pay men and women. Because if you actually looked at some of these jobs, they don't necessarily always, they don't really differ in terms of skills, although the skills themselves are different. They don't necessarily differ in terms of amount of education required. There's some jobs that we've increased the educational requirements for, like childcare workers, although we haven't in fact increased, the pay associated with being a childcare worker. And especially if you're talking about jobs that don't require post-secondary education, that distinction between blue-collar jobs predominantly held by men that pay working class or better wages versus pink-collar jobs that are predominantly held by women who don't have post-secondary degrees, and they usually pay minimum wage, making them more jobs associated with, the working poor. And there are some arguments that suggest that's because a lot of these pink collar jobs in particular are the types of work that women do at home. And it's just that kind of devalued care work, which we'll come back to that concept in a second. So are women choosing these jobs? Are they being pushed towards these jobs? What is going on? What are the causes of gender job segregation? Well, first of all, there are the cultural beliefs. That we're raised with this concept of gender roles and gender norms, and this then filters into our expectations regarding men and women's work roles, that we see some type of work, especially if it's dirty, especially if it involves, labor, with your hands. We tend to see this type of work as being, pertinent to men. Versus if it involves care work, if it involves nurturing, if it involves, taking care of people, we're more apt to see this as women's work. And your book does note, of course, that cultural beliefs vary by time and place. And I like to say that because, there's nothing about these jobs that are inherently for men or for women. In class, I often make the joke, name one job that only one sex can do. And really, in all my years of teaching this class and having this discussion, the only one that, students have landed on are things related to biological like functions, right? So only a woman can be a surrogate, a surrogate mother. Only men can be, only cisgender men can be, sperm donors. Only, cisgender women could possibly, and as well as transgender men, but only people that have the biological capacity to produce milk can be like a wet nurse. I don't know if that's actually a job that still exists in today's world, but for the most part, a lot of these jobs that we say are men's jobs and women's jobs, pure social construction, which means we can construct a different definition of it if we wanted to over time. But because we have these expectations that some jobs are for men and some jobs are women, we oftentimes socialize boys and girls, teenage boys, teenage girls, to have certain skills and experiences that then make them better fits for these men's jobs and women's jobs. Think about who's more likely to get a toolkit at age 5, or a play toolbox. Probably a boy child as opposed to a girl child. Who's more likely to get a baby doll and be taught, rock the baby? Probably a little girl as opposed to a little boy. Who's more likely when they're in middle school and high school, has a part-time job, taking care of kids for the neighborhood as a babysitter? Probably a teenage girl as opposed to a teenage boy. And so, these experiences build, these skills build. And so then what happens is then when you're an adult, you maybe have kind of, without even realizing it, you maybe have kind of cultivated a job history and a job skill set that makes you a better hire and a better fit for a women's job or versus a man's job. And a lot of this, of course, is, once again, it's socially constructed. It doesn't have to be this way. We assume that women are nurturing. We pressure women to be nurturing. We put them on the path to being nurturing, at a young age. And thus the fact that a lot of women do wind up in fields that involve emotion work or care work, that's not necessarily surprising. It doesn't mean, though, that men can't do those types of jobs. It doesn't mean that men don't have those types of capacities. It does mean that we have not necessarily groomed them for those types of careers. Your book also notes that gender also intersects with other characteristics that lead to stratification in the workforce, race, social class, sexual orientation. Those types of social identities also come into play and kind of shape, once again, our experiences and the skills that we bring to the table when we're looking for work as adults. And so your book talks about the socialization hypothesis, right? The idea that we are socialized, we're socialized to have, skills and characteristics that make us more or less a better fit for these jobs that have been subjectively defined as being men's and women's jobs. And that's what is leading to this occupational sex segregation. There's also the role of employers. To what extent do they feel comfortable hiring men as opposed to women, women as opposed to men for certain positions? Your book talks about this as the employer selection hypothesis, that employers just feel comfortable and are more apt to hire men for jobs deemed masculine, women for jobs deemed feminine. And then, of course, there is the selective exit hypothesis, which your book talks about just in terms of, there is data that suggests that when people have jobs that are gender atypical, meaning that they are the minority in that occupation in regards to their gender, they're more likely to leave that job, and they're more likely to leave it more quickly than someone who's gender typical. And they don't really necessarily, there are a lot of factors that can play into that. One factor that I'm going to introduce specifically, because I want you to kind of think about this, is sexual harassment. So sexual harassment can take many forms. It can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, it can be physical harassment, on the basis of sex, which isn't the same thing as sexual interest, right? People aren't necessarily doing it because they're interested in you sexually, but it's the fact that they are treating you differently. They are harassing you in some way because of your sex, because of your gender. So that's kind of the typical form we think of. But there are two additional forms of sexual harassment. Quid pro quo, the something for something. I'll give you a raise if you go on a date for me. If you want to get the good accounts, you need to be willing to flirt with me as your boss. This is the obviously sleazy form of sexual harassment that people are becoming more and more aware of. This is unacceptable. This is the type of sexual harassment that exists in Hollywood in particular that, the Me Too and Time's Up movement kind of shone a light on. But in regards to that selective exit hypothesis, I want to make sure that you understand a more subtle form of sexual harassment and the type of sexual harassment that continues to exist today, that continues to pop up in lawsuits, because this is the type that I think sometimes people are less aware of, and it's called a hostile work environment. So this is where you create a work environment that's uncomfortable, that's not conducive to someone being able to do their job to the best of their abilities, and it has a lot to do with how you treat them in regards to their sex. So, if you are a female barber and you work in an all-male environment and, they're playing softcore porn in the break room, and all the barber stations have up, Playboy centerfolds and Penthouse magazine centerfolds, you can make an argument for hostile work environment. It isn't just, of course, for women. Men can make an argument for a hostile work environment. If you're working in an office setting and, it's all women, they're always, talking about, their sexual experiences, men's penis sizes. I don't know, what are some other things, their periods. Once again, you can make this argument that, I'm experiencing a hostile work environment on the basis of my sex. And so, research does suggest that sexual harassment does contribute to ongoing occupational segregation between genders. It makes people who are gender atypical for an occupation, it makes them less likely to maybe apply for a job and accept a job. And then it makes them less likely, if they are experiencing hostile work environment, it makes them less likely to stay on the job for a prolonged period of time. Which is what the selective exit hypothesis is getting at. And there has been research, particularly in fields like the military, military officers, firefighters, police officers, that have combined those two, the selective exit hypothesis and the hostile work environment, as to why women leave those fields at a much higher rate comparative to men. It's not the job itself, it's how they are treated on the basis of the fact that they are a minority in terms of their gender identity. So moving on to a second explanation for the gender pay gap, and this one is, what role does gender discrimination and sexism play? So, there can be some discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion. And this kind of relates to the employer selection hypothesis. For people who study this, the argument is, is this the result of bias, right? Where people are biased against people of a specific sex, of a specific gender identity, and thus just don't want to hire them for a job, even though they are capable for that job, even though they have the requirements for that job. And that's clearly and obviously wrong. What's harder to prove, but some people suggest is more likely, is the role of homophily, where people prefer to hire people like them. And this is where past sexist, past sexual discrimination comes into play. Because if a lot of managers, upper management, if a lot of them are men, particularly white men, and homophily is coming into play, and there are no policies pushing them to hire people who don't look like them, then what results is they hire people they are most comfortable with, which are people who look like them. And this might lead to there being gaps in minority hiring as well as women being hired. When trying to prove gender discrimination, like I said, it's like all policies, it's tough. Just like the policies are tough to enforce, it can also be difficult to prove, that you have been truly discriminated against. Because multiple people will apply for the job, and if they're all qualified, then employers do have a good deal of leeway in who they choose to give the job to. We can kind of look to some of the trans men experiences, what their narratives have suggested, right? That oftentimes they talk about after transitioning from being a cisgender woman to a transgender man, they talk about how their experiences in the labor force have improved, how people take them more seriously, they're more apt to respect their authority, to look to them for expertise. Similarly, a few years ago, a news story went viral where a man who had a name that was associated with women, I want to say maybe it was Ashley or Kelly, he noticed how he would be treated and, how he was being overlooked during his hiring process. And he basically changed his resume and his applications, he and his LinkedIn profile, so that instead of going by his first name, he went by his first initial and then his obviously male middle name, and then he wrote about his experience, how, I think he was in the field of engineering, but how like almost overnight, the number of people responding to him in a positive fashion, in terms of being interested in working with him in recruitment or offering him a job, how it increased. So, there are some non-systematic first-person narratives that suggest that even though we don't necessarily always do a great job of capturing to what extent does this gender discrimination exist, it clearly does. And it exists despite the fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. We've talked about this in previous chapters. And so, what beyond discrimination, if we're thinking about it in terms of other ways in which, sex can impact how people are treated on the job, whether they get the job, whether they get the promotion, your textbook asks you to consider, the ways in which sexism, that systematic degradation and devaluation of women, and mistreatment of women, how does that come into play? And they talk about it in three forms. They talk about it in forms of hostile versus benevolent sexism, which we've discussed in previous chapters, right? But, people can have hostile sexist experiences on the job, where they're clearly discriminated against, they're put in dangerous situations, they are sexually harassed. All of that is hostile sexism. And then there's that benevolent sexism, where maybe your boss doesn't give you the feedback that you need in order to improve your work because he assumes that as a woman, you are sensitive and he doesn't want to hurt your feelings. But this winds up being long-term detrimental. Or, they don't give you like the late night shifts because they consider it to be dangerous for women. They don't give you the accounts that require a lot of travel because they assume you don't want to go away from your family. But long-term, this holds back your career. So that's benevolent sexism. And so, they talk about, how they play out in different ways. They talk about, your textbook talks about, how, especially for hostile sexism, is likely to happen in occupations where women is seen as a symbolic threat, where men are concerned that they are going to enter the occupation in large numbers. And then think about what we've established is the trend. When women enter our occupation, the occupation becomes devalued. It results in less pay. So men who currently have that occupation sometimes push back against women entering the occupation in large numbers because they view them as a threat to their kind of financial security and the value that their profession is currently offering them. Another kind of form sexism takes is double bind. Both sexism and androcentrism factor in here. It's this idea that in order to be successful at her job, oftentimes a woman needs to do masculinity. But then in order to be liked and accepted by her boss, her colleagues, maybe clients, she also needs to do femininity, that feminine apologetic that we talked about before. It is a very tricky balance that women are constantly having to kind of figure out. Be too masculine and you're unliked, and people lash out at you for that. Be too feminine and you are likely going to be perceived as being ineffectual and not great at what you do. And so that's the second form. And then the third form is just that preferential treatment for men. And so when your book is discussing this, they introduce a lot of concepts related to glass. And I'm going to introduce like one or two more. So oftentimes we talk about women in the glass ceiling, that women are able to experience a certain amount of mobility in their profession, and then they hit this invisible barrier that prevents them from rising to the top. And people oftentimes point to the glass ceiling as an explanation as to why there aren't more female CEOs, given the number of women who earn an MBA. At this point, it's more women than men, given the number of women who are middle-level managers, because that's starting to become more women than men. But CEOs are overwhelmingly men. Upper-level positions, our executive positions, are overwhelmingly men. And that's because, there isn't this clear promotional path. So the glass ceiling suggests you rise up to a certain point, you can see the higher position, right? That's the glass aspect, right? You can see it, but there's this invisible barrier preventing you from getting it. Now, your book talks about another glass concept, glass cliff, because for women who do get those kind of top executive positions, they oftentimes get them when the company is failing or in trouble. So it's like, and it's worth noting that this has been shown also with racial minorities, that female CEOs, racial minority CEOs, they're likely to be granted that position when a company isn't doing well, because at that point the company almost has nothing to lose. Like if you manage to save the company, great, but it's kind of almost setting, and that's the idea that you're on a cliff, like it's a precarious position. The company isn't stable, so if you aren't able to save it, you probably will be blamed for the company failing and going under, even if it was clearly trending that way already. A good example of that type of experience in regards to women is Marissa Mayer, who at the time, some years ago when she was made CEO of Yahoo was already struggling, in terms of keeping up with Google. This was early on when Google and Yahoo were like in competition with one another. Now, of course, Yahoo's dead and, Google is Google. But so at the time when they made Marissa Mayer CEO, and it was a big deal that she was a woman and was put in charge of this company, the company was already in this precarious position. She almost would have had to have done amazing work to save Yahoo. And then the fact that she does not, the really detrimental thing about the glass cliff phenomena is then sometimes this is used as a future justification for not having women, for not having minority CEOs, because there are only so few of them. And if the few of them have been in charge of companies that were already struggling, it makes it seem like they can't be successful in the position, which is, of course, just not fair. A concept that I want to introduce in regards to that glass concept that isn't discussed by your book, but has been discussed by previous textbooks I've used, is the concept of glass walls. And so if you think about glass walls, right, it's the idea there is no ceiling, so you can rise up as high as you possibly can. However, you can't escape that department. So basically what that's saying is that there are some departments that are overwhelmingly women, and women can rise to the top of that department. But oftentimes, because those departments are not fully valued, and not necessarily integral to the company's overall functioning, it doesn't help you then become like a chief executive. Instead, you're just at the head of that department. Probably the best example of that is HR. HR is overwhelmingly dominated by women. And so the head HR, the head HR person is almost always going to be a woman, but no one's going to then take a person that has a lifetime of that experience and be like, oh yes, you will also be a good CEO of this company. Instead, you're able to rise to the top, but in this kind of limited capacity. Which means that there is going to be some constraints on your earning power, and there are going to be some constraints in terms of your level of authority in the company. Now, in regards to the glass ceiling, there are debates about, is it in women's best interest to like lean in and play by the rules and try to break that ceiling? There's been some people that have argued that, with gender discrimination and sexism, perhaps this isn't even just like a worthwhile goal for most women to consider. They're probably going to be put in the position where, they're going to be in a glass cliff situation, and, and that's precarious and that's harmful for, women's kind of long-term, occupational success. So maybe they should lean back. There was a book called Leaning Out that discussed how, women just kind of exit this kind of fast track, upwardly mobile career pathway. They kind of just tap out altogether. And so this is something that comes up. Before we leave women behind and we start focusing more on the concepts that relate to men, sticky floor. And it's worth noting, sticky floor doesn't just apply to women, but women are more likely to be in these positions. And these are just positions where there really is no pathway to mobility. Like there isn't a clear path about like, how do I get a better job from this job? It basically becomes a dead-end job. You're stuck, and thus the word sticky. So now going to men. The concept that relates to kind of how men excel in female-dominated positions when they are the gender atypical person is glass escalator. The glass escalator concept is the idea that men are more quickly promoted in female-dominated fields. And the two best examples of this traditionally have been education, where given the number of female teachers, the number of male principals and male school superintendents is disproportionately high. And if you look at their careers, what you often see is men are more quickly promoted and led to on the administrative track, more so than their female counterparts. This also exists in the world of nursing. Given the number of women who are nurses versus men, the number of men who are nursing managers is disproportionately high. And the phenomena is called glass escalator because if you think about an escalator, you step on and then you literally don't have to pick your feet up again. And you eventually will find your way, at the top, right? The escalator just takes you on up to the next floor. And that's the idea, is that, men step into these female-dominated fields in an entry-level position, but they much more quickly rise to the top of the field than their female counterparts. I'll save glass closet for the moment. Let me talk about glass cellar, glass floor, because the other thing about glass, in addition to being invisible and perhaps hard to break if it's tough glass like the glass ceiling glass, is that it's also slippery. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to glass floor or glass cellar in regards to the fact that some men get. There are male-dominated positions that aren't actually that high-paying, and they're very dangerous. And it is worth noting that 90% of occupational deaths do happen to men. Men are much more likely to be in positions where their jobs have a certain amount of workplace safety issues. And so these jobs are dangerous. They may or may not have mobility out of them, but the kind of key thing is you are likely to slip and get hurt. So, that's that idea of it being a glass floor or glass cellar. Before we leave all of these glass metaphors behind, let's discuss one final one. And this one is one from your book, and that's glass closet. And it's the idea that, for both men and women, lesbian and gays, there is the sense that in some occupations, it might be necessary to hide your sexual orientation, to hide your sexual identity because of, heterosexism, homophobia, preconceptions that people might have around sexual minorities that might hinder you from experiencing mobility, from being granted, from getting hired, getting promotions. And so thus you have, even if you're not closeted in your real life, to a certain extent, you might have to be closeted in your work life.